The small coastal town, nestled against the rugged shoreline, clung to the land like a cluster of barnacles, its very existence tied to the rhythm of the tides and the comings and goings of the daily ferry. For 19-year-old Caleb, a recent high school graduate with restless hands and a quiet demeanor, working at the ferry company was a temporary stop, a way to earn a few dollars, helping with the docking and undocking of the ocean spray. He felt an unspoken dissatisfaction with his life, a yearning for something beyond the predictable ebb and flow of small-town existence, a sense of being adrift, even on solid ground. His shifts often stretched late into the night, especially with the last freight run, when the pier was deserted save for the rumble of the ferry's engines and the distant cries of gulls. The air was crisp with the scent of salt and pine, carrying the faint, metallic tang of the sea. The darkness pressed in, vast and encompassing, broken only by the yellow glow of the pier lights and the distant winking navigation beacons. It was on one such night, when the moon hung low and heavy in the sky, casting a silver sheen on the water, that Caleb heard it. A singing voice. It wasn't the distant hum of a lobster boat returning late, or the mournful, familiar cry of a foghorn echoing across the bay. This was a melody, pure and ethereal, seemingly rising from below the weathered timbers of the pier itself, a sound that bypassed his ears and resonated directly in the hollow spaces of his chest. Curiosity, a dangerous companion in the quiet, isolating dark, tugged at him with an insistent, almost physical pull. He moved cautiously to the edge of the pier, his boots scuffing softly on the damp wood, peering down into the inky blackness below. The tide was low, revealing the barnacle-encrusted rocks and seaweed-draped pilings beneath, slick and glistening in the faint moonlight. The water, usually a dark, churning mystery, seemed unnaturally still here, almost inviting. Using the familiar handholds, the rough ropes and sturdy beams, he began to climb down, his boots finding precarious purchase on the slippery stones, drawn by the irresistible sound, a melody that promised answers to questions he hadn't even known he was asking. He reached the pitch-dark space beneath the pier, a cavern of shadow where only slivers of moonlight filtered through the gaps in the decking above, creating shifting patterns of silver and black. The air was cool and damp, heavy with the smell of brine and damp wood, a scent that usually brought comfort but now felt charged with an unearthly presence. Here, the only sounds should have been the gentle lapping of waves against the rocks, a soft, rhythmic sigh of the ocean, a constant, soothing whisper. Except for the song, of course. It was clearer now, closer, a hauntingly beautiful lament that seemed to resonate in the very air around him, vibrating in the ancient timbers of the pier. Each note was a silken thread, weaving itself around his senses, drawing him deeper into the shadows, his eyes adjusting, straining to pierce the gloom, following the source of the melody with an almost desperate urgency. He felt no fear, only an overwhelming sense of destiny. And then he saw her, sitting with her back against one of the massive seaweed-draped wooden pillars, bathed in a soft, silvery glow cast by the moon, was a girl of breathtaking, impossible beauty. She seemed to materialize from the shadows, a vision of ethereal perfection. Her skin, luminous in the faint light, seemed to shimmer with an inner luminescence, as smooth and unblemished as polished pearl, reflecting the moonlight with an otherworldly radiance. It was a complexion that seemed untouched by sun or wind, impossibly soft, inviting to the touch. Her hair, a cascade of deep dark emerald, flowed around her shoulders and down her back, interwoven with strands of phosphorescent algae that pulsed with a soft, captivating light, like distant galaxies swirling in miniature, illuminating the shadows around her. It moved with a life of its own, swaying gently even in the still air. Her face was a masterpiece of delicate features, sculpted with an artistry that defied nature. A slender nose, high cheekbones that caught the light, and lips that were the color of deep sea coral, full and perfectly formed, parting slightly as the melody flowed from them, each breath a note. Her eyes, the color of the deepest, most unfathomable ocean, were wide and fathomless, reflecting the moonlight with an intensity that promised infinite depths and ancient wisdom. They held a silent, knowing gaze that seemed to pierce through him, seeing not just his surface but the very core of his being, recognizing a kindred spirit, a destined servant. Her torso, rising from the water, was slender and graceful yet perfectly formed. Her breasts, full and high, were exquisitely shaped, their pale, smooth curves barely visible above the gentle undulations of the water, hinting at a soft, inviting warmth beneath the surface. They seemed to swell slightly with each breath she took, a subtle movement that captivated his gaze. She was sitting directly on the water, her bottom half submerged in the gentle, barely rippling waves that lapped at the base of the pillar. The water around her seemed to glow faintly, disturbed only by the soft undulations of her unseen form beneath the surface, as if the very sea acknowledged her presence. She was the source of the singing, her voice a siren's call made manifest, a melody that bypassed his ears and went straight to his soul, bypassing all reason, all defense. He was immediately, irrevocably, desperately in love. All his life he had felt a quiet emptiness, a yearning for something more, a vague dissatisfaction that gnawed at him. And now, in this hidden, moonlit grotto, he had found it. He felt an overwhelming urge to kneel before her, to offer her everything he possessed, his life, his very being, to become her devoted servant. He got near, his steps hesitant, reverent, as if approaching a goddess. "What's your name?" he whispered, his voice hoarse, barely daring to break the spell, afraid to shatter the fragile beauty of the moment. But she didn't answer. Her eyes remained fixed on him, unblinking, unreadable, and the song continued, a seamless, unbroken stream of pure enchantment, weaving itself tighter around his heart. As the melody flowed from her lips, a new, chilling layer of sound emerged, distinct from hers, yet somehow intertwined with it, a deeper current beneath the surface of the song. Another voice, cold, ancient, and utterly devoid of human emotion, seeped directly inside his mind, bypassing his ears entirely. A whisper that resonated with absolute authority, a command that brooked no argument. "I want them all. Bring them to me." Caleb felt a strange, detached calm settle over him, a profound sense of purpose replacing all other thoughts. The words were a command, not a request, an undeniable imperative. He dully nodded, his mind a blank slate, save for the echo of the song and the chilling directive, his will completely subsumed. He turned, his body moving without conscious thought, as if guided by an unseen hand, and began to climb back up the rocks, leaving the luminous figure behind, the melody still ringing in his ears, a promise and a curse, a new purpose forged in moonlight and madness. The next day dawned grey and overcast, mirroring the somber mood that had inexplicably fallen over Caleb, though he himself felt a strange, unsettling serenity. He arrived early for the night ferry, his usual cheerful greetings replaced by a quiet intensity that his co-workers barely noticed, accustomed to his reserved nature. His mind was clear, focused on a single, terrible task, every detail meticulously planned. He moved with a meticulous precision, his hands performing familiar tasks with an almost robotic efficiency, while his thoughts plotted the intricate dance of destruction. He knew the ferry's weak points, the subtle vulnerabilities of its ancient mechanisms, the places where a small adjustment could lead to catastrophic failure. He understood the flow of its systems, the delicate balance that kept it afloat. He worked on the hydraulic system that controlled the bow ramp, making a series of minute, almost imperceptible adjustments to the pressure valves, loosening a critical fitting just enough to ensure a slow, insidious failure, a leak that would only become apparent under stress. He then moved to the emergency bilge pumps, tampering with their electrical connections, disabling them just enough so they would fail under pressure, short-circuiting when most needed, but not so obviously that they would be detected during routine checks. It was clever, insidious, designed for maximum devastation with minimal immediate detection, a silent, unseen killer. He even managed to subtly jam a few of the emergency exit mechanisms on the car deck, ensuring that certain doors would stick, trapping those inside when the water began to rise. He moved through the ship like a ghost, unseen, unheard, a silent harbinger of doom, his actions driven by an unshakable conviction, fueled by the siren's song that now played constantly in his mind. As twilight bled into full darkness, painting the sky in bruised purples and deep blues, the ocean spray pulled away from the pier, its massive engines rumbling, a low, confident thrum. It was laden with its usual cargo, 24 cars, packed with families returning from weekend trips, vacationers heading home, and local residents all oblivious to the fate that awaited them. Below deck, the car deck hummed with the quiet anxiety of confined spaces, the smell of exhaust and damp rubber. Above, on the passenger decks, at least 100 people chatted, read, or simply watched the receding lights of the town, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of their phones or the ferry's interior lights. Children laughed, couples held hands, elderly folk dozed. The ferry reached a distance of perhaps 2 miles from the shore, a point where the lights of the town were still visible, but too far for easy return, too far for immediate rescue. It was then that a shudder ran through the massive vessel, a deep, unsettling tremor that resonated through the deck plates, a groan that seemed to come from the very heart of the ship. A low metallic groan, unlike any the crew had ever heard, emanated from below, a sound of immense strain and impending collapse. Panic began to ripple through the passengers, a sudden collective gasp of fear. The deck beneath their feet tilted, subtly at first, then more pronounced, sending drinks sliding across tables and unsecured objects crashing. Alarms began to blare, a harsh, insistent wail that cut through the night, piercing the calm, a sound of pure terror. The crew rushed to their stations, their faces etched with confusion and dawning horror, their shouts of "What's happening?" lost in the rising cacophony. Below on the car deck, the water began to seep in, a dark, icy tide rising rapidly from the floor, swirling around tires. The hydraulic system gave way completely, the bow ramp dropping with a sickening clang, creating a gaping maw for the sea, a wide open mouth swallowing the ocean. Cars began to slide, their tires losing traction on the slick metal, bumping and scraping against each other. People screamed, a collective cry of terror that was quickly muffled by the rising water, their voices choked by fear and the cold. Some passengers, trapped in their vehicles by jammed doors or simply paralyzed by fear, watched in wide-eyed horror as the water engulfed their cars, the windows becoming distorted portals to their watery graves, their last moments filled with the sight of dark, swirling depths. Others, reacting instinctively, scrambled out of their vehicles, only to find themselves wading through the freezing, rapidly deepening water, the icy shock stealing their breath. On the upper decks, chaos erupted. People surged towards the lifeboats, pushing and shoving, their faces contorted with fear. A desperate, primal scramble for survival. The crew, overwhelmed, tried to maintain order, shouting instructions that no one heard. But the tilt of the ship grew steeper, making every step a struggle, sending people stumbling and falling. The ocean spray was sinking, and sinking fast, a leviathan consumed by the very element it traversed. Many jumped, leaping into the black, freezing cold water, hoping to swim to shore, or at least to find a piece of floating debris, a desperate gamble against the odds. But the shock of the icy Atlantic was immediate and brutal, stealing their breath, seizing their muscles, leaving them gasping and paralyzed. The current, deceptively strong, began to pull them away from the rapidly submerging ferry, dragging them into the vast, indifferent darkness. The screams of the dying echoed across the water, a chorus of despair that slowly faded as the cold claimed more and more victims, their voices growing weaker, more distant, until only the gurgle of the sinking ship remained. The last sounds were the gurgle of the ship as it went under, a final monstrous sigh, and the desperate fading cries of those who still clung to life, their hope extinguished by the frigid embrace of the ocean. All of them died in the end, swallowed by the dark, hungry sea, their lives extinguished, their stories untold. The next day, the small coastal town was a place shrouded in grief and disbelief. The news of the ferry disaster spread like wildfire, leaving a trail of shock and sorrow in every home, every family. Rescue boats scoured the waters for days, but found only debris, scattered personal belongings, and the grim evidence of a terrible tragedy. The air was thick with mourning, the flags at half-mast, the church bells tolling a somber rhythm that seemed to echo the town's collective heartbreak. While the town mourned, a strange calm had settled over Caleb. He felt no remorse, no guilt, only a quiet anticipation, a profound sense of satisfaction. The siren's song, now a constant, beautiful hum in his mind, had replaced all other emotions. As dusk began to fall, painting the sky in hues of bruised purple and blood orange, he made his way back to the pier, his steps light, almost eager, drawn by an irresistible force. He climbed down the rocks to the hidden space beneath, the air still damp, the waves still lapping gently, a soft, welcoming rhythm. There she was, sitting by the same wooden pillar, her back to him, her emerald hair shimmering even in the cloudy daylight that filtered through the pier, catching the last vestiges of light. She was even more beautiful now, if that were possible, her allure intensified by the recent offering. The muted light seemed to enhance her ethereal glow, making her appear almost divine, a goddess of the deep. Her lips, the color of a deep, rare rose, were slightly parted, and the soft, haunting melody flowed from them, filling the damp space with its intoxicating beauty, a song of triumph and ancient power. Her eyes, when she slowly turned her head to meet his gaze, were pools of liquid sapphire, deep and ancient, yet sparkling with a new, subtle triumph, a predatory satisfaction that made her beauty even more compelling. Her skin, impossibly smooth and flawless, seemed to radiate a cool, inviting warmth even in the chill air, drawing him closer, promising eternal comfort. She was sitting directly on the water, her bottom half submerged in the gentle, barely rippling waves that lapped at the base of the pillar. The water around her seemed to glow faintly, disturbed only by the soft undulations of her unseen form beneath the surface, as if the very sea acknowledged her presence. She was the source of the singing, her voice a siren's call made manifest, a melody that bypassed his ears and went straight to his soul, bypassing all reason, all defense. "I love you," Caleb whispered, his voice thick with adoration, his heart overflowing with a devotion that consumed him entirely, leaving no room for anything else. "I did what you asked. I brought them all. Now, I want you. I want to be with you. Forever." He took a step closer, his hand reaching out, trembling with desperate longing, eager to touch her, to finally claim his reward. She stopped singing. The melody ceased abruptly, leaving an echoing silence that felt vast and empty, a sudden void after the overwhelming sound. A slow, knowing smile spread across her coral lips, a smile that was both beautiful and utterly terrifying, a predator's smile. Then a low, melodic laugh, like the tinkling of ice in a crystal glass, escaped her throat. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated amusement, a sound that held no warmth, no love, only cold, ancient satisfaction, a chilling finality. Without a word, she leaned back, her body arching gracefully, a vision of fluid power, and with a fluid, effortless motion, she dove into the water. As she submerged, her lower half, previously hidden by the gentle waves, was revealed. It was not legs, but a magnificent iridescent tail, shimmering with scales of emerald and sapphire, tipped with delicate, translucent fins that pulsed with an inner light. It was vast, powerful, and utterly alien, a creature of the deep. The sight of her tail, the undeniable proof of her true nature, the monstrous reality beneath the beautiful facade, did not change his feeling. His love, his obsession, was too deep, too absolute, too ingrained in his very being. If anything, it intensified his desire, transforming his adoration into a desperate, primal need, a final, consuming madness. "Wait!" he cried, his voice breaking a raw, desperate plea that echoed in the confined space. He watched as her luminous form, her emerald hair trailing like a banner, vanished into the dark water beneath the pier, leaving only faint, shimmering trails of light. Desperate, consumed by a love that had become a fatal madness, he followed her without hesitation. He launched himself into the cold, dark water, plunging into the depths where she had disappeared. The icy shock was immediate, but he barely registered it, his mind fixed on the glowing vision below. He swam down, into the crushing darkness, chasing the last lingering glow of her hair, the faint echo of her laughter, a sound that promised eternal bliss. He was engulfed by the sea, swallowed by the abyss to never be seen again. And the ocean, ever hungry, ever patient, claimed another soul, adding it to its countless silent victims. The Titan's embrace, a colossal oil carrier, cut a slow, ponderous path through the vast, indifferent expanse of the South Atlantic. Its sheer size was a testament to human ambition, a floating city of steel and machinery, carrying its precious cargo across endless leagues of water. On board, dozens of shipworkers, a transient community of men bound by the sea and the endless hum of engines, went about their routines, their lives a rhythmic cycle of watches, meals, and the constant vigilance required by the immense vessel. The days were a blur of maintenance and watch duties, the sun a relentless eye in the sky baking the decks. The nights, however, were long and monotonous, broken only by the cold brilliance of the stars, which seemed closer and more numerous out here in the deep ocean, and the rhythmic churn of the propellers, a constant lullaby of industry. It was one such night, deep in the second watch, when a young deckhand named Marco, a quiet man from Lisbon, known for his steady hands and even temperament, was startled awake. A sound. It wasn't the usual groan of the ship's stressed metal, the distant roar of the ocean's untamed power, or the familiar clang of machinery from the engine room. It was a song, impossibly clear and beautiful, seemingly coming from just outside his small porthole, a melody that seemed to resonate within the very steel walls of his cabin, making the air around him hum with an ethereal vibration. It was a melody unlike anything he had ever heard, weaving through the ship's massive structure, bypassing his ears and resonating directly in his very bones, a harmony so pure it brought tears to his eyes, a profound, aching beauty. He felt an ache in his chest, a yearning he couldn't name, a profound sense of longing for something unknown, something ancient and deeply familiar, as if a long-lost memory was finally resurfacing. The notes seemed to pull at his very soul, unraveling the threads of his conscious thought. He scrambled from his bunk, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs, a drumbeat to the unseen music that now filled his entire being. Drawn by an irresistible pull, a fascination that bordered on compulsion, a siren's call he could not deny, he stumbled out of his cabin and raced through the labyrinthine corridors, the narrow passages seeming to stretch and twist around him, guided only by the growing intensity of the song. The haunting music grew louder with every step, guiding him, pulling him forward like an invisible current, a powerful undertow of sound. He passed sleeping crewmates, their faces slack in slumber, oblivious to the ethereal concert that now filled his mind, their quiet snores a stark contrast to the crescendo in his head. The air in the passageways, usually stale and heavy with the scent of oil and sweat, seemed to shimmer with an unseen energy, charged with the melody's power. He burst onto the immense windswept deck, the night air cool and sharp against his face, a sudden invigorating rush that momentarily cleared his head, only for the music to flood back in. He ran to the railing, leaning over the edge, his body trembling with anticipation, straining to locate the source of the enchanting sound, his gaze fixed on the dark, undulating surface of the ocean, which now seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The song swelled, filling the night, surrounding him completely, a vast, enveloping embrace of sound. It was no longer a gentle melody, but a colossal symphony, a chorus of voices that seemed to emanate from the very depths of the ocean, vibrating through the ship's massive hull, a living, breathing sound that consumed all other sensations, all other thoughts, leaving only the song. He felt the ship itself hum with the music, a deep, resonant vibration that coursed through the deck beneath his feet, making the steel thrum like a giant instrument, echoing the profound harmony. The stars above seemed to shimmer and dance in time with the melody, their distant light twinkling with renewed intensity, and the ocean below seemed to glow with a faint, internal light, a luminescence that pulsed with the rhythm of the song, revealing fleeting, ghostly shapes just beneath the surface. The air grew heavy, thick with a strange, sweet scent like lilies and salt and something else. Something ancient and unknown, yet strangely alluring. A scent that promised forgotten wonders and untold secrets. It filled his lungs, intoxicating him, making his head light and his senses reel, dissolving the last remnants of his earthly concerns. He felt a profound sense of peace, a feeling of coming home, of finally belonging, as if this was where he was always meant to be. The sound became too much, too vast, too powerful for human ears. It overwhelmed his senses, crushing him with its beauty and its force, a wave of pure sonic energy that threatened to tear him apart, yet simultaneously promised ultimate bliss, a transcendent experience. The world spun, the stars blurred into streaks of light, forming spiraling galaxies in his vision, and then, mercifully, darkness claimed him. He passed out, collapsing onto the cold steel deck, his last conscious thought a single perfect note. The next morning, his crewmates found him, sprawled near the railing, shivering uncontrollably despite the rising sun, which cast long, distorted shadows across the deck. His eyes were wide, unfocused, and a strange, feverish light burned within them, a light that spoke of visions and madness, of having seen things no mortal should. He seemed utterly disconnected from reality, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon, as if still listening, still captivated by the echoes of a melody only he could truly hear. They tried to ask him what happened, their voices rough with concern, but he only mumbled, his voice hoarse and distant, as if speaking from a great distance, from another world, a world beneath the waves. His lips moved, but the words were unintelligible, lost in a private delirium. Then, with a sudden chilling clarity that cut through his delirium like a knife, he uttered a single profound statement. Atlantis exists, and we're near it. We need to go there. A ripple of unease spread through the small group of men. Atlantis was a myth, a sailor's tale, a fantasy, a drunken dream, not something a rational man spoke of in earnest, especially not a seasoned deckhand like Marco, who had always been so grounded. They exchanged nervous glances, the bright morning sun doing little to dispel the chill his words brought, a cold dread that seeped into their bones. Concerned, the crewmates tended to him, wrapping him in blankets and coaxing him back to his bunk. They noticed a faint, almost imperceptible sheen on his skin, like dried salt, but it felt strangely smooth, almost scaly to the touch, and a faint, sweet smell clung to him, reminiscent of the ocean at dawn, but deeper, more primal, like something ancient and vital. The ship's medic, a gruff but kind man named Dr. Petrov, examined him thoroughly. He found no physical injuries, no broken bones or cuts, but Marco's pulse was erratic, his pupils dilated to pinpricks, and a strange, almost manic energy pulsed beneath his skin. His body temperature was unusually low, yet he radiated a strange internal heat that seemed to defy logic. Dr. Petrov gave him a strong sedative, hoping to calm his agitated mind and give him some much-needed sleep. He watched Marco as the drug took hold, a flicker of professional curiosity mixed with personal unease in his gaze. He'd seen shell-shocked sailors, men broken by storms or isolation, but this was different. This was a man possessed. Marco drifted into a restless slumber, muttering incoherently about music and the depths, about cities of light beneath the waves, about voices calling his name, beckoning him home with an irresistible pull. He twitched, as if swimming in his sleep, his fingers occasionally splayed as if reaching for something unseen, something just beyond his grasp. The crew exchanged worried glances, trying to dismiss it as a bad dream, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and the vast loneliness of the sea. They tried to forget the unsettling words, to rationalize the incident, but a seed of doubt had been planted, a tiny, insidious thought that began to sprout in the quiet corners of their minds, growing with each passing hour. For the next day, Marco remained withdrawn, refusing food, his eyes constantly drawn to the porthole, as if listening for something only he could hear, his ears straining against the ship's mundane sounds, seeking out that phantom melody. He barely responded to questions, his mind clearly elsewhere, lost in the echoes of that unearthly song, a prisoner of its beauty. The ship continued its journey, the routine a comforting balm against the strange incident, but the atmosphere felt subtly altered. A tension like a taut wire began to stretch across the decks, a silent, unspoken dread that permeated every corner of the Titan's embrace. A subtle change began to creep over the Titan's embrace itself. Some crew members reported faint, almost imperceptible echoes of music in the dead of night, sounds they quickly dismissed as the wind or the ship's machinery or their own imaginations playing tricks. But the whispers grew louder, more insistent, weaving themselves into the fabric of their sleep. A few complained of vivid, unsettling dreams, of being pulled down into glowing, watery caverns, of seeing impossible structures of light beneath the waves, of feeling a strange, intoxicating warmth in the crushing dark. A warmth that promised both comfort and oblivion. They woke up disoriented, with the taste of salt on their tongues and a lingering sense of profound wonder and terror. One young engineer, a practical man named Sergei, swore he saw a flash of phosphorescence in the ship's wake, too large and too bright to be any known marine life, a fleeting glimpse of something vast and alive, moving with impossible speed. He dismissed it as a trick of the light, a reflection, but the image lingered, haunting his peripheral vision, appearing when he least expected it. The ship's instruments, too, seemed to occasionally glitch, showing anomalous depth readings or strange sonar contacts that vanished as quickly as they appeared, leaving the operators scratching their heads and checking their equipment, convinced of a malfunction. The ocean, usually so predictable in its vastness, felt suddenly alive, watching a colossal, sentient entity. The following night, a veteran crew member, old Captain Elias, was roused from his sleep by a soft rustling. He opened his eyes to find Marco standing silently by his bunk, a spectral figure in the faint glow of the emergency lights, his face illuminated by an eerie internal luminescence that seemed to emanate from his very skin, a soft blue-green glow that pulsed faintly. Marco's eyes were still wide, still holding that unsettling, distant light, but now there was a desperate urgency in them, a wild, almost ecstatic gleam, as if he were on the verge of a profound discovery, a final, glorious revelation. "Do you hear the music, Captain?" he whispered, his voice barely audible yet filled with an unnerving intensity, a plea for understanding, a desperate invitation to join him. "It's calling us. It's time. The city awaits." Without waiting for a reply, he turned and walked silently out of the cabin, his steps light, almost floating, as if gravity had less hold on him, as if he were already accustomed to a different medium, to the embrace of water. Captain Elias, a man of long experience and quiet wisdom, felt a prickle of unease, a cold dread seeping into his bones, a premonition of disaster he couldn't shake, a sense of impending doom. He had seen men break under the sea's pressure, under the isolation, but never like this, never with such a terrifying serenity, such a willing, eager surrender. He rose, pulling on his trousers, his movements stiff with a sudden fear that turned his limbs to lead, and followed Marco, his bare feet silent on the cold deck, the ship's familiar hum now sounding strangely hollow, like a distant mournful dirge, a funeral song for the living. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the core that something was terribly wrong, something beyond the realm of human understanding, something ancient and hungry lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for its next meal. Marco moved with a strange, almost ethereal grace, as if guided by an unseen force, a puppet on invisible strings, drawn by an irresistible, silent command. He made his way unerringly to the immense deck, to the same spot near the railing where he had collapsed the night before, drawn by an irresistible magnet, a fatal attraction that pulled him towards his destiny, towards the dark embrace of the ocean. The night was clear, the stars brilliant and the sea was calm, a vast dark mirror reflecting the heavens, deceptively tranquil, hiding its terrible secrets beneath its placid surface. Marco walked directly to the edge of the carrier, his silhouette stark against the starlit horizon, a figure on the precipice of an unimaginable plunge, silhouetted against the vastness of the cosmos and the deeper vastness below. Captain Elias quickened his pace, a sudden dread gripping him, a cold knot in his stomach tightening with every step, his breath catching in his throat, a silent scream building in his chest. "Marco, stop," he called out, his voice a harsh whisper in the quiet night, desperate to break the spell, to pull him back from the brink of whatever lay below. He lunged forward, reaching for the young man's arm, his fingers outstretched, just inches from grasping him, from saving him from an unknown fate. But he was too late. With a final resolute step, a silent, almost joyful exhalation, a look of profound peace on his face, a beatific smile that chilled Captain Elias to the bone, Marco launched himself over the railing, a silent, graceful dive, disappearing into the blackness below without a splash. It was as if the water simply opened up to receive him, swallowing him whole without a ripple, leaving no trace, no disturbance on the surface. Captain Elias rushed to the edge, peering down into the churning water where Marco had vanished. He expected to see him surface, to hear a splash, a desperate cry for help, the frantic struggle of a man overboard. But there was nothing. No sign of him on the surface, only the dark, undulating expanse of the ocean, undisturbed as if it had never been broken, as if Marco had never existed. Instead, just beneath the dark, undulating water, Captain Elias saw movement. Not the thrashing of a man, but something else entirely, something vast and powerful, moving with an alien grace, a fluid, inhuman motion that defied all known biology. Large, powerful fishtails, shimmering with an unnatural, phosphorescent glow, cut through the depths, moving with incredible speed and elegance, like dancers in a hidden ballet, performing for an unseen audience, their movements hypnotic. And then he saw it. Long, flowing strands of what seemed to be hair, impossibly beautiful and luminous, trailing in the water, glowing with an ethereal light as they descended into the fathomless dark, pulling Marco deeper into the ocean's embrace. The glow intensified for a moment, revealing glimpses of slender, pale forms, their features indistinct but undeniably humanoid, their eyes like distant stars, beckoning, before fading into the crushing black, leaving only the memory of light and a profound sense of loss, a chilling emptiness. Captain Elias stood frozen, staring into the abyss, the image burned into his mind, a terrifying tableau that would forever haunt his waking hours, a secret he would carry to his grave. He didn't raise the alarm immediately. He couldn't. What would he say? That a man had jumped, pulled down by glowing fishtails and luminous hair, by creatures from myth, by the very sirens of legend. They would think him mad too, fit for Dr. Petrov's sedatives, locked away in a padded room, stripped of his command and his sanity. He stood there for a long time, the cold night air biting at his skin, the silence of the sea now filled with a phantom melody in his own ears, a faint, persistent hum that echoed Marco's last words, a whisper of Atlantis, of a city of light beneath the waves. He knew with a chilling certainty that Marco had not drowned. He had been taken, claimed by the deep, by something far older and more powerful than any storm or current, something that had waited patiently for its time. The next morning, the ship's log simply recorded Marco's disappearance as man overboard, presumed lost at sea. No one questioned it too deeply. The sea claimed its own after all, and sometimes men simply vanished without a trace, swallowed by the vastness. But Captain Elias knew the truth, a truth he could never speak, a burden he would carry alone, a silent testament to the ocean's hidden horrors. He saw the subtle changes in his crew, the quiet glances at the ocean, the sudden shivers that had nothing to do with the cold, the distant looks in their eyes, as if they too were listening, straining to hear the siren's call. Some swore they heard the faint music too now, a whisper on the wind, a hum in the hull, a melody that promised both wonder and doom, a creeping contagion of sound. The Titan's embrace continued its journey, but it was a different ship now, carrying not just oil but a silent, pervasive dread, a haunting secret that clung to every steel beam and every drop of condensation. The laughter was less frequent, the conversations more subdued, and every man on board felt the invisible weight of the ocean's gaze, a sense of being watched from below. And sometimes on the longest, darkest watches, Captain Elias would find himself drawn to the railing, staring into the depths, almost expecting to see that luminous hair, almost hearing the faint, beautiful call, a seductive whisper from the abyss that promised ultimate knowledge and eternal peace, a final, irresistible embrace. He would quickly turn away, his heart pounding, knowing that some melodies once heard can never be forgotten, and some depths, once glimpsed, can never be truly escaped. The ocean, he now understood, held more than just fish and currents. It held ancient, hungry secrets that sang and waited patiently for the next soul to claim. The voyage would never truly end for him. Hamish was a good man, strong as an ox and intimately familiar with the waters. He had the sea in his blood, a lineage of fishermen stretching back further than anyone could trace, men who wrestled their living from the unforgiving depths. But something happened out there, something that twisted his mind and stole his soul piece by agonizing piece. He swore it was a mermaid. Most folk just shook their heads and blamed the whiskey, or the loneliness that can creep up on a man out on the open sea, gnawing at his sanity in the long, dark watches. Yet there was a raw, primal terror in his eyes, too real for drink, too deep for a simple delusion. And the way he spoke of it, with a strange, desperate longing, a yearning that chilled more than any ghost story ever could. It wasn't just fear, it was a terrible, consuming obsession. The waters around the Black Isle had always been different. There was an ancient brooding quality to them, a sense of something far older than man. Old tales, whispered in hushed tones over pints in the pub, when the fire was low and the wind howled like a banshee, spoke of things that dwelt in the deep, things that lured sailors to their doom. Selkies with their human forms and their seal skins, kelpies shape-shifting water horses waiting to drag one down, and worse, things without names, things that defied description. But no one ever spoke of a siren, not truly, not like what Hamish described, a creature of such unearthly beauty and unspeakable horror. The old songs, the warnings in the shanties were just stories, cautionary tales to keep young lads from straying too far, until Hamish. It was a cold night, even for late autumn in the Moray Firth, the kind of cold that bit right through oilskins and chilled to the bone, making teeth ache and fingers stiff, making the very air sting lungs with every breath. It was the kind of night where the sea breathed heavy, a dark, restless giant. The stars were like scattered diamonds on black velvet, too bright, too many glinting with an indifferent ancient light. The air was thick with a damp, heavy mist that clung to everything, making the familiar coastline vanish into a grey shroud, swallowing the distant lights of Portnocky until they were just faint, blurry glows. Hamish, with his stubborn heart, was out earlier than usual, wanting to get a good haul before the sun even thought about peeking over the horizon. He was just past the Black Isle, near those jagged skerries that rose like broken teeth from the water, their black forms barely visible through the swirling fog when he heard it. A voice. It was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard, like 1,000 angels singing a lullaby, or the purest note of a crystal bell resonating through the very air. It wasn't loud, not at first, a mere whisper carried on the cold breeze, but it carried, soft and clear, drifting over the water, weaving through the mist, pulling at something deep inside him, something ancient and forgotten. He tried to shake it off, telling himself it was the wind or the creak of his own boat, the Selkie's kiss, a trick of the exhausted mind. But the melody persisted, growing clearer, more defined, each note a silken thread drawing him in. And with each note, he felt the chill in the air lessen, a strange, unnatural warmth seeping into his bones, a warmth that felt inviting, almost seductive. It was a warmth that promised comfort, solace, a release from the biting cold, a promise of something he didn't even know he craved, yet it felt utterly wrong, a trick of the senses, a lure. Against all his fisherman's sense, against the years of ingrained caution and respect for the sea's dangers, against the very instinct that had kept him alive on these treacherous waters for decades, he started to maneuver his boat between the treacherous rocks, drawn by that unearthly melody. The closer he got, the more the singing seemed to dance around him, coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. It was enthralling, like a spider's web spun from pure sound, each strand vibrating with an irresistible pull, wrapping around his mind, his very soul. He felt his will dissolving, his mind clouding like smoke filling a room. He couldn't think, couldn't reason, couldn't even remember why he was out there in the first place. His hands, calloused and strong from decades of hauling nets, moved on their own, cutting the engine, letting the Selkie's kiss drift silent amongst the black water and the ancient stone, the only sound that haunting, beautiful song. The fog grew denser here, swallowing the stars, making the world shrink to just him, his boat, and that hypnotic song, a world of swirling grey and intoxicating sound. He leaned over the gunwale, peering into the inky depths, his breath misting in the cold air, searching for the source of that captivating song. He saw fleeting shadows, shapes that seemed to glide just beneath the surface, too quick to identify, too fluid to be fish, but they moved in time with the melody, like dancers in a watery ballet, beckoning him deeper into the unseen. The silence after the engine cut was thick, oppressive, broken only by the gentle lapping of waves against the hull and that ever-present mesmerizing hum. Hamish strained his eyes, his heart pounding a strange rhythm against his ribs, a drumbeat of anticipation and dread growing louder with every passing second. He saw a shimmer, a faint phosphorescent glow beneath the surface just beyond the reach of his boat's feeble light. It pulsed with the rhythm of the song, a living light in the dead water, drawing his gaze, hypnotizing him. He leaned further, his face almost touching the frigid water, the cold biting his cheeks, but he barely noticed it, his ears straining to catch every note, every nuance of that intoxicating sound. The air around him grew heavy, thick with a strange, sweet scent, like lilies and salt and something else, something rotten, yet strangely alluring, a scent that hinted at both beauty and decay. Then it was there, just beneath the surface, a face, so impossibly beautiful, with eyes like polished obsidian and lips that curved into a soft, beckoning smile. The skin was pale, almost translucent, luminous in the faint glow, radiating that unnatural warmth. Long dark hair like spun moonlight floated around it like a halo, swaying gently with the unseen currents. The singing swelled, filling his head, drowning out all thought, all fear, all sense of self, replacing it with a singular, overwhelming desire to be closer, to touch, to surrender. He reached out, his fingers brushing the surface of the water, trying to touch that ethereal beauty, to confirm it was real, to feel the warmth that emanated from it, to become one with the melody. As his fingertips broke the surface, the face shifted. The stunning features twisted, contorted into something utterly monstrous, like clay melting and reforming into a nightmare, a mask of beauty ripped away to reveal the horror beneath. The eyes once so captivating bulged, black and empty, like the abyssal depths themselves, devoid of any light or warmth, only consuming darkness. The skin, once pale, stretched taut, revealing veins like black ropes beneath the surface, throbbing with an unseen, malevolent life. The lips stretched, tearing at the corners, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth, too many teeth like a shark's maw, each one glinting wickedly in the faint light, dripping with a dark, viscous fluid. And the song, the beautiful melody, ripped into an ear-splitting, high-pitched shriek that tore through the night, a sound of pure, unadulterated malice and hunger, a sound that seemed to claw at the very fabric of his sanity, ripping it to shreds. Hamish recoiled, stumbling backward, the scream echoing in his skull, a physical blow that sent him reeling. He lost his footing, his heavy boots sliding on the wet deck, and he tumbled headfirst into the icy water, the shock of the cold a brutal slap of reality after the siren's spell. As he hit the surface, the Selkie's Kiss's engine roared to life, a deafening burst of sound in the sudden silence, a mechanical scream of its own, and the boat lurched forward, smashing into the unforgiving rocks with a splintering crash that echoed through the fog, a sound of destruction and despair. He was in the water, the shock of the cold stealing his breath, making his lungs seize, the icy grip of the sea a stark contrast to the unnatural warmth he had felt moments before. The wreckage of his boat was a dark silhouette against the mist, slowly sinking, its mast disappearing beneath the waves like a dying hand. And then something grabbed him. Not a hand, not a tentacle, but a powerful unseen force, like a current with malicious intent, a living undertow, pulling him down, down into the black abyss, into the crushing darkness. He thrashed, kicking and clawing, fighting with every ounce of strength he had, his oilskins heavy, dragging him deeper, making every movement a struggle against the inevitable. The water closed over his head, the scream still reverberating in his ears, now muffled and distorted like a distant dying wail, a memory of horror. He fought, but it was relentless, dragging him deeper, the pressure building in his ears, his chest threatening to burst, his lungs burned, screaming for air, his vision blurred, filled with swirling blackness and faint phosphorescent trails, and the cold started to numb his limbs, a creeping paralysis that promised a swift, silent end. He was losing the fight, feeling the life draining from him, the last vestiges of hope abandoning him, ready to give up, to simply let go and sink into the eternal dark, to become another forgotten secret of the sea. Then his hand, flailing wildly in a last desperate gasp, a final desperate act of defiance, struck something solid. Rough, barnacle-encrusted rock, sharp and cold, a fragment of the earth itself. With a desperate surge of adrenaline, a final defiant spark of life, he clamped onto it, his fingers locking around the jagged edge, pulling with all his might, ignoring the pain as the barnacles tore at his skin. Slowly, painstakingly, every muscle screaming in protest, every breath a ragged gasp, he dragged himself out of the water onto a small, slippery outcrop of rock, barely larger than a fisherman's dory, a tiny island of salvation in the vast, hostile sea. He lay there gasping for air, his body shivering uncontrollably, teeth chattering so hard he thought they'd crack, the cold seeping into his very bones. He lay there soaked and shivering, the taste of salt and fear in his mouth, his body aching from the struggle. The fog still clung to the rocks, muffling all sound, making the world feel small and isolated, a tiny stage for his private horror. He thought he was safe. He was wrong. The air grew heavy again, that sweet, rotten scent returning, stronger now. A ripple disturbed the water near the rocks, a slow, deliberate undulation, like something vast moving just beneath the surface. Then, a head surfaced, followed by a long, slender neck, then shoulders. It wasn't the beautiful face he'd seen. This was its true form, a nightmare made flesh and scale, a vision of pure ancient evil. Its skin was a sickly, translucent grey, stretched taut over a skeletal frame, with patches of dark, slimy scales clinging to it like a disease, shimmering with an unnatural iridescence, reflecting the faint light of the pre-dawn sky. Its hair, what he'd thought was long, flowing black hair, was a tangled mass of seaweed and dead fish, reeking of the deep, tiny, pale crabs scuttling within its strands, their eyes like pinpricks of malice. Its eyes, those terrifying black orbs, were set deep in its skull, glowing with an unholy, malevolent light, like embers in a charnel house, fixated on him. Its mouth, still agape from the shriek, was a cavern of jagged, yellowed teeth, some broken, some too long like a shark's, coated in a viscous, dark slime that dripped into the water, dissolving into the blackness. Below its emaciated torso, where legs should have been, was a monstrous, thrashing tail covered in sharp, bony plates, each one tipped with a cruel, dark barb, like a weapon forged in the abyss, capable of rending flesh and bone. It was wider than his boat had been, easily 20 feet long, and its movements churned the water into a frothing maelstrom, sending icy spray over the rocks, blinding him with salt and fear. It smelled of brine and decay, of something ancient and dead, something that had festered in the lightless depths for eons, a stench that turned his stomach and made his eyes water, making him gag. The creature didn't move immediately. It simply floated there, its black eyes fixed on him, a predatory intelligence burning within them, assessing its prey. A low, guttural gurgle emanated from its throat, a sound that was both a laugh and a promise of pain, a sound that spoke of ancient hunger. It began to circle the small island, slowly at first, then faster, its massive tail creating a vortex in the water, making the rock beneath Hamish tremble, threatening to drag him back into the depths. He lay there, sprawled on the cold rock, too weak to move, too terrified to scream, his voice caught in his throat, a silent plea for mercy that would never be heard. This was it, he thought. This was how he died, dragged to the depths by this unholy thing, devoured by the very sea he had loved and respected his whole life, his bones scattered amongst the rocks. He closed his eyes, preparing for the end, for the tearing teeth, for the final icy embrace of the deep for oblivion. The creature lunged, its grotesque mouth open wide, its tail thrashing the water into a frenzy. A dark shadow looming over him, blotting out the faint light of the sky. He felt the spray on his face, the foul, fishy breath on his skin, the chilling wind of its passage, the cold dread of imminent death. But then a faint golden light touched the horizon, a thin, shimmering line of hope, growing brighter with each passing second. The first sliver of dawn, painting the eastern sky with hues of rose and amber, a promise of light after the endless night. The mermaid froze, its movements ceased, its circling stopped. A guttural, agonizing screech tore from its throat, a sound of pure agony and rage, of something ancient recoiling from the light, something that could not bear the sun's touch. It was a sound that was not meant for human ears, a sound that would haunt his nightmares for the rest of his days, a sound that spoke of untold suffering and primal hatred. It recoiled, its monstrous form shaking violently, as if burned by the light, its scales shriveling slightly, smoking where the first rays touched them. With a final desperate splash, it plunged back into the depths, vanishing beneath the waves as the sun's first rays kissed the water, turning the dark, churning surface into a glittering expanse, a deceptive calm. Hours later, half frozen and barely conscious, his skin chafed and raw from the rocks, his mind a shattered mess, he was found by another fishing boat, the Sea Serpent, drifting aimlessly near the wreck of the Selkie's Kiss. They pulled him aboard, wrapped him in blankets and gave him hot tea, their faces etched with concern and confusion, trying to make sense of the wreckage and the wild look in his eyes. He was babbling, they said, about a song and a voice, and how he had to go back. He needed to find her. He spoke of her beauty, her allure, but never of the horror, never of the monster, as if his mind had purged the terrifying truth, leaving only the intoxicating lie. He would try to explain, but the words would catch in his throat, replaced by a strange, wistful look in his eyes, a desperate longing that was almost painful to witness. They thought he was mad, of course, a good man gone to pieces by the sea like so many before him, broken by the ocean's indifference. He spent days drawing crude maps, marking the skerries, muttering about the song and the warmth, his fingers tracing invisible melodies in the air. He was discharged from the hospital, but he wasn't the same. His eyes held a distant, haunted look, and he rarely spoke, except to himself, or in short, cryptic sentences about the sea. He stopped going to the pub, stopped talking to his old mates, shunning their pity and their well-meaning advice. He just sat by the window, staring out at the sea, a strange, desperate longing in his gaze, as if waiting for something to call to him again. Everyone tried to convince him it was just a hallucination, a nightmare brought on by the cold and the shock, the grief of losing his boat, a trick of the mind. But the light in his eyes, that strange, almost feverish glow, told a different story, a story of a soul ensnared. His wife, a poor woman, tried to reach him, but he was already too far gone, lost in a world only he could see. He would often hum, a low, tuneless melody, and sometimes, late at night, she would hear him whisper, "She's waiting. She's singing." A few weeks later, after the moon was full and the tides were high, one night he was seen launching a small rowboat from the shore. No engine, just oars, a silent, determined departure. He moved with a quiet determination, his gaze fixed on the dark horizon, drawn by an invisible thread. A few folk saw him, thought it strange but didn't intervene, used to Hamish's eccentricities after his ordeal. Hamish was never seen again, but sometimes on cold, misty nights, when the wind howls just right, a faint, beautiful melody drifts over the waves, pulling at something deep inside, a song that promises warmth and eternal sleep. and one shivers, knowing that the sea keeps its secrets and sometimes it calls for its own. Did you like our stories? Like the video and subscribe to hear more tales of the unknown here at the Mystery Files.